frei, fußfrei. Good evening and hello everyone to this evening's lecture and debate about Russia and the Western far right. Our photo we had in the marketing for the event was one of Matteo Salvini in a t-shirt with a picture of Vladimir Putin painted on, standing in front of the Kremlin and laughing. And if you look at the nationalists like the FPÖ, if you look at Rassemblement National as they're now called, the former Front National in France, if you look at the Lega Nord and others, you might think they as nationalists are actually quite anti-Russia, and at the same time we know, we have evidence we'll hear about today, that there are actually quite a lot of links. Of course, as you will know, one link is that the FPÖ in Austria itself has actually a partnership agreement with United Russia, the party which is in government, Putin's party. And all of this is very disconcerting, particularly at the time when we again have evidence that Russia is meddling in elections. Russia is meddling via Facebook and other means in democracies. Russia is spending a lot of money in foreign democracies in Europe. And therefore, it is very, very timely that we talk about what those links are and what we can do about them. And therefore, we are delighted and honored that Anton Shekhovtsov will talk about this topic today. I may introduce him, and then he will talk about 30 minutes and give us a presentation. Afterwards, of course, as always, you can ask questions, make comments, and we'll enter a debate. Anton Shekhovtsov was born and raised in Sebastopol, the largest city on the Crimean Peninsula in Ukraine. He finished his studies there in 2009. Since then, he has held postdoctoral positions in the UK, Austria and Poland. His expertise includes the European far right, their relations with Russia, and illiberal tendencies in Central and Eastern Europe. He's editor of the book series Explorations of the Far Right and also member of the editorial board of the open access e-journal Fascism, Journal of Comparative Fascist Studies. His most recent book is called Tango Noir, Russia and the Western Far Right, which is what we will talk about today. And currently he's, good for us, visiting fellow at the Institute for Human Sciences, this Institut für die Wissenschaft von Menschen, in the 9th district of Vienna. So a very warm welcome to Anton Shekhovtsov, and we're very much looking forward to your lecture.
Thank you very much, Josef, and thank you for coming. I will do a very short presentation that will be followed by a larger discussion. Shall I? Yep. But first I want to tell you that the current relations between various Russian actors, and now I need to make a pause and tell you that if I say Russia or Russians during the presentation, doesn't mean the Russian people. It means the actors in Russia, but sometimes it's just easier to say Russia or Moscow. So these current relations, they're nothing new, and I will devote part of my talk to show you how long that these relations have a long history, and I will start with the National Bolshevik movement in Germany. Before the Second World War, there was quite a tiny movement in Germany at that time, and they were National Socialists, obviously, but with a huge stress on the socialist part, or even Bolshevik part. They were fascinated by the Soviet Union, and they thought of the Soviet Union as a brotherly proletarian nation. For them, for National Bolsheviks, the main enemy was the capitalism. At that time, capitalism for Germany was also associated with the West. Germany itself did not think of itself as the West, but the West was Britain and France, and also basically those countries that were punishing Germany for the First World War. And they looked at the Soviet Union with admiration, and they wanted to follow the example. And again, they had this connection with the Russian people and the Soviet people as the proletarian people. I will not talk about the Nazi-Soviet Pact. You all know of them. But what's also more interesting is that the developments in the European fascist scene after the Second World War. In Germany and in Austria, in West Germany and in Austria, there was a so-called neutralist movement. And parts of the neutralist movement, those people who wanted their countries to be neutral and not join NATO, part of that movement was far right. And for German nationalists, the division of Germany into two was a disaster, and they thought that if West Germany joins NATO, then the division would be permanent. And as we know, West Germany joined NATO in 1955, and Germany was divided for a very long time. But those movements, they disappeared during the 1950s, but a very interesting new movement appeared, and that was related to the European or pan-European fascism. And these two people, Francis Yockey and Jean Tirard, they were representatives of the European neutralist movement, although Francis Yockey was an American, but he was a very bizarre American. He hated America so much that he moved to Europe. And they came up, two of them, Francis Yockey came up with the idea of European imperium that would include Europe and the Soviet Union. And he was anti-Semite and fascist. For a very long time, he was a neutralist as well. So he thought that both the US and the Soviet Union, they're bad for Europe. But after the beginning of the anti-Semitic trials in Czechoslovakia and the Soviet Union, then he thought that, okay, so the Soviet Union is actually becoming better. It's the America that is still colluding with the Jews, but the Soviet Union and the socialists, they started persecuting Jews. So his interest moved to the Soviet Union, and he was in favor of this European imperium. Jean Tirard in the 1960s, 1970s was also a neutralist with slight sympathies towards the Soviet Union, but in the 1980s he embraced National Bolshevism. He would refer to himself as a pan-European Bolshevik. And in the beginning of the 1980s, he came up with the idea of Euro-Soviet Empire, which would be an empire that includes the fascist Europe and the communist Soviet Union. But those plans, they were never realized, obviously. But after the fall of the Soviet Union, Russia sort of opened up for cooperation with the far right. And Alexander Dugin was the first person who started cooperating with the far right. At that time, he was a leader of a very small fascist party called National Bolshevik Party. And he established relations with the French, Belgian far right, Italian far right. Alexander Dugin was actually in Vienna recently in February. But you should understand that he started very, very early. In 1992, that was not the first meeting. He started traveling to Europe and have various talks and discussions with the European far right already at the end of the 1980s, even before the fall of the Soviet Union. Then, of course, Vladimir Zhirinovsky of the Russian far-right party called Liberal Democratic Party of Russia, a very strange name for a far-right party, but still, started cooperating with the European far-right. He would invite Jean-Marie Le Pen for his birthday party in Moscow in 1995. They also had plans to have a sort of patriotic international conference, which indeed took place in Moscow in 2003. Vladimir Zhirinovsky, he's here, and he presided over a meeting that included several representatives of the European far-right parties, including the National Front, including Deutsche Volksunion, and some other parties. But all those projects of uniting the far right and somehow including Russian actors, they would all fail. The state was not interested. Putin, during his first presidential term, since enjoyed the honeymoon with the West. He would talk to mainstream politicians only. He would not talk to the fringe politicians. The Kremlin was not generally interested in cooperating with the far right. But it started to change around 2004, 2005. And that is related to to a series of color revolutions in the post-Soviet space. In Georgia in 2003, Ukraine in 2004, and Kyrgyzstan in 2005. And because all those color revolutions, they were not real revolutions, obviously. They were very successful protests against the electoral fraud. And they were sparked by reports from established electoral observation missions like the OSCE or ODIHR or OSCE. That elections in those countries, they were stolen. And that mobilized people to go onto streets and protest. And in 2004, 2005, in Russia, there started to appear very shady NGOs that provided basically politically motivated electoral observation. So if in a country in the post-Soviet space there was an election and the pro-Russian candidate would win, they would say everything went fine. And that was very often in contrast to the conclusions of the established electoral observation organizations such as the OSCE or the European Union or PASE, the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe. So these organizations, Russian organizations, they also started to cooperate with the far right, with far-right politicians. And one example is Johan Gudenus, who was one of the electoral observers in Crimea in March 2014. And that referendum was followed by the annexation of this Ukrainian Republic. He was obviously not the only one. At that referendum, there were people from the Front National, from the Belgian far-right organizations. So around 40 people, and I would say about 85% of them were coming from far-right organizations. Others were coming from pro-Russian organizations or far-left organizations, such as the Communist Party of Greece. But going back, that was first stage, and that was the beginning of this fake electoral observation or politically biased electoral observation. What is interesting about it is that it became institutionalized, and that was the first institutionalized form of cooperation between Russian actors and the far right. The second one, the second stage, it's started in 2008. And it was connected to the war in Georgia in August 2008. Russia invaded parts of Georgia in a 5-day war, but the idea, during this war and immediately after the war, there was an understanding in the Kremlin and around the Kremlin that Russia failed to win the information war. they understood that they failed to convince the West, the international community, that the war was justified. And they started to reconceptualize completely the media, the Russian media, especially the international media. They had RT, well, they had Russia Today since 2005, but Russia Today in those times was, I would call it like a vegetarian TV channel. It would only show pictures of beautiful Russia, and it was essentially an instrument of soft power, but in a good way, like presenting Russia. So they decided, okay, so it doesn't really work. Yeah, we have to somehow change the whole thing. And in 2009, they renamed Russia Today into RT, and not to conceal the name. And that is a very common mistake, that people think that RT is to conceal the origins. No, it's not to conceal the origins. They simply decided that RT would not really show so much about Russia. So it's not about, it became not about Russia. Rather, it became about the West. So the concept changed. If Russia Today was, its message, its narrative was essentially that Russia is good, with RT, with the changes in 2008, 2009, the message became the West is bad. This is why they don't understand why Russia is good. And of course, they started to engage with the far right, because who else would talk on the TV? And what Western politicians would talk how bad the West is. And they found various conspiracy theorists, far-right politicians, far-left politicians as well, isolationists, Eurosceptics, etc., etc. And I have, Richard Spencer Richard Spencer is an American neo-Nazi. He became infamous last year in August after Charlottesville massacre, essentially in the US. But in 2012, RT would invite him as an expert on Libya or Syria. But of course, he had no education sufficient to comment on those issues. But they simply could not find people who would offer the audience the narratives and the messages that would be good for RT, to back up that message that the West is bad, that they are attacking Syria and Libya, etc., etc. And that, again, the media engagement with the far right was the second institutionalized form of cooperation. More recently, we were witnessing the development of two last stages. This is political support and financial support in some cases. The Front National obtained a loan of 9 million euros for the regional elections in France. There were some small organizations that also somehow were supported by the Kremlin. In political support, I would also include Marine Le Pen going to Moscow on the eve of the presidential elections and meeting with Putin. So it was a very clear message that the Kremlin supports Marine Le Pen in the presidential election. There's also cross-party cooperation now, and it started with the FPÖ. In December 2016, the FPÖ delegation went to Moscow to sign the cooperation agreement with the ruling party in Russia, which is called United Russia. But I want to say that in the FPÖ's case, the first documented contacts that were established between the FPÖ and Russian actors was 2005. And 2005 was also a time when Jörg Haider left the party, and the FPÖ under Strache already, they felt the need to develop their international contacts. And there was a meeting in 2005 when they would meet with the diplomats from Iran, from Bulgaria, from Hungary, but also from Russia. That meeting was arranged by Ewald Stadler, who was at that time still a member of the FPÖ, before he left to join Haider's new party, the BZÖ. And Ewald Stadler is a very interesting person in this context. He may be insignificant now, but Ewald Stadler was one of the main drivers of the Russian contacts between the Austrian far right and Russian actors and the Kremlin. And he was also a person who would regularly go to the post-Soviet space and observe elections in the region. What's also interesting, the FPÖ wanted to sign the cooperation agreement with the United Russia for quite some time. As I said, 2005 was the first probably meeting, the first contact with the diplomats. In 2008, the FPÖ, some of the FPÖ members, like Barbara Kappel, she founded an organization called Austrian Technologies, and this organization was trying to promote Austrian technologies in other countries, especially in Russia and Ukraine and Kazakhstan. But politically, when Austrian technologies would hold conferences, they were all political, and they were all pro-Kremlin. They all supported Moscow's foreign policy interests. And then they would invite United Russia politicians, members to Austria, and they discussed sort of cooperation with the United Russia already at that time. But they signed the agreement. They signed the agreement only in December 2016, and I think that was connected to the political situation in Austria itself. 2016, it was the year of the presidential elections. That was the very first time in essentially post-war history of Austria that no member of the large parties got into the second round of the elections. And then Alexander Van der Bellen was not really considered in Russia as a pro-Russian candidate. Norbert Hofer was from the party that already wanted to cooperate with the United Russia. So they made a decision, the United Russia made a decision to sign a cooperation agreement with them. And that was before the second round of the presidential election that they made the decision. The signing of the agreement took place after Van der Bellen won, but still the decision was taken. Hofer as president of Austria to Russia to sign this agreement. So it had a failed symbolical meaning for Russia. But yes, it was a failed development. The signing of the agreement with the FPÖ was followed by the signing of the agreement with the Lega Nord, which is now called Lega, the Italian far-right party led by Matteo Salvini. What is interesting, they signed this agreement in April 2017. But the decision to sign this agreement was taken on the day they decided to sign the agreement with the FPÖ. So it was December 2016. What is also interesting about that agreement, both texts are now available online, is that they are identical, they're almost identical. Which means that either three parties discussed the contents of the agreement, or it was the United Russia that gave the text and then the other parties signed. So I don't think that three of them really discussed the contents. I think it was just the text that was put forward by Moscow, and they signed it. There are some differences, but they are very minor differences between the Italian agreement and the Austrian agreement. The National Front did not, the French Front National, they did not sign the agreement, but the cooperation still exists. And the Front National received political support and also media support. And if we look at Germany in last year, we would see that RT and another news service called Sputnik News, they indirectly and sometimes directly supported the Alternative for Germany. Indirectly, those were reports about the failings of multiculturalism and the refugee crisis, so basically the narratives that the AfD promotes. RT and Sputnik would also criticize Merkel more than anyone else, so it was this indirect support in the media, but also Twitter bots sometimes also participated in campaigns, in Twitter storms, especially Wahlbetrug, this electoral fraud. There were 2 campaigns with the message that the German government was trying to steal the elections. But those Twitter storms, they failed in the end. And what is interesting about Austrian elections last year is that I would say there was no Russian interference in this. Because essentially large Austrian parties, they are sort of sympathetic towards the Kremlin. This is about business relations, this is about energy, etc., etc. So I think the Kremlin felt rather okay about any outcome of the Austrian elections. Either the status quo would be in place, or the FPÖ, the blatantly pro-Kremlin party, would be part of the government. So I wouldn't say there were any. There wasn't no political support or media support for any of the parties in Austria last year. Yeah, this is a picture of Salvini, who met Putin already in 2014. Salvini was super happy. He had 20 minutes talk with Putin in Milan, and he boasted on his Facebook that he would finally meet the great Vladimir. Now I want to, I want to also comment on what it all means, but probably not all, but what it means for the far right in Europe, this cooperation with Russia. And I would remind you that probably you know, probably some of you don't know, that in the beginning of the noughties, in 2002, 2003, so before the invasion of Iraq, Saddam Hussein's regime was under sanctions. Those were sanctions, food for oil, and there were a lot of actors in the West, in Europe, who wanted to circumvent those sanctions. Many of those people were coming from the far right. There is, from the Russian side, there is a documented proof that the Communist Party of the Russian Federation and Zhirinovsky's party, the Liberal Democratic Party of Russia, they participated in various schemes to circumvent the sanctions. There are also rumors, unfortunately they are not yet proven, that Front National and Jean-Marie Le Pen he was personally involved in circumventing the sanctions, the Iraqi sanctions. It is also known that Ewald Stadler and Jörg Haider, they would meet with Saddam Hussein. It is also documented that there was an agreement between the Iraqi authorities and Stadler and Haider, that they would receive 5 million euros for lobbying for Hussein's interests in Europe. And so working with Hussein, and especially in the area of circumventing sanctions, was, I think, a huge source of money for the European far right at that time. And also this Congress of Patriotic Parties, essentially the far right international conference in Moscow, it was, at least half of it was devoted to the criticism of the Western sanctions against Iraq. And considering the fact that before that conference took place, Zhirinovsky had traveled to Baghdad several times that year, I presume that there was financial support for this particular type of conferences that Zhirinovsky started. Why I'm saying this is that the far right, and it's not only about Iraq, now it's also about Syria. There is a connection between the dictatorships and the far right. Dictatorships, authoritarian regimes that are under Western sanctions, they need political support from the West, from people who would criticize those sanctions and try to lobby for their interests. And we see that Alternative for Germany, Front National, many parties on the far right, they would criticize those sanctions. And I would not be surprised to learn that these parties receive money from the Syrian regime of Bashar al-Assad, for example, in some years. Because sometimes now it is happening, but the proof comes later. And regarding the FPÖ, in 2017, last year, in March 2017, Gudenus, Jochen Gudenus and Johannes Hübner, they would invite to Vienna a person, Sergei Gaidukevich. He's not Russian, but he's a Belarusian. He leads a party, again, called Liberal Democratic Party of Belarus, which is a far-right party, and it's a sister party with the Zhirinovsky's party in Russia. And I only started this, exploring this connection, but the Belarusian far-right, they claim that they have an agreement with the FPÖ too, and also with Front National. And this is interesting. This needs further research. Unfortunately, no public documents are available, but they claim that they have this cooperation agreement. What is interesting about Gaidukevich is that when Hussein, again, was in power, Gaidukevich was one of those people in Belarus who, acting on behalf of the regime of Alexander Lukashenko, he essentially helped Saddam Hussein to circumvent the sanctions. And it's also almost a proven case, and especially after the unfortunate leaks on WikiLeaks, we know that at least the American security agencies, they documented some of the contacts between Gaidukevich and Hussein's regime. And then also Gaidukevich was accused of laundering money that were related to the illegal arms trade. So these people, they are very dodgy, they are very shady, and of course it's quite worrying that Gudenus and some other FPÖ leaders would have relations with this person. And Gaidukevich recently, and this is how I became, I started to have interest in this particular topic. Gaidukevich a couple of days ago said that they would hold a congress of the nationalist parties in Minsk, and that he also invited the FPÖ and Front National and AfD. So this is an ongoing process. There's still a huge unknown area that needs to be researched, and it's happening right now in front of our eyes. And I do think that that should all worry us. especially in the Italian case, where Matteo Salvini is taking a hardcore line on immigration and refugees, even much more radical than probably the FPÖ here. So this is a danger for the European Union and for several common foreign policies in Europe. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We'll just change the stage quickly. Thank you very much. That was very worrying. I will ask some questions, and of course, as always, if you have questions or comments, please just raise your hand, and we'll bring you in. Otherwise, we'll bring you in later. I was interested when you said that the whole thing started to progress, this whole idea of cooperating more closely, supporting them and so on, started really to take off under Putin when those revolutions happened. So would you argue that the whole support campaign, if you can call it like that, was actually not so much ideologically driven, so driven by people like Dugin, but much more driven by the perceived interest, the power interests of Putin and Russia, that he thought, they're breaking away, so we need to do something about. Would you argue that it's much more driven from that perspective?
Yes, that was not ideological from the very beginning. And also the organizations that provided those politically biased electoral monitoring that appeared in Russia, their contacts with the far right were also, that was because of their personal histories. For example, one of the persons who was involved, Alexei Kochetkov, and who started this, I would say, business in 2003, 2004. He was, in the 90s, he was a member of the Russian Fascist Party. So he would still have the networks. And this is very important, the idea of networks. What people you know, what people in Russia you know, what people abroad you know. So it was, but it was just about networking. Yeah? How to build that support, or how to build that network of electoral observers. For the Kremlin at that time, the ideology was not an issue at all. It developed only recently with this, I would say, ultra-conservative right-wing turn of Putin's regime in the recent years.
How much influence does a person like Dugin have these days?
I wouldn't say that he has any influence now. He had more influence in the past. It's talking about Dugin and his significance and his importance. We need to understand various contexts. Yeah, for the Kremlin policies, he's not important at all. But for people who belong to particular elite groups in Russia, Dugin is important because his network of contacts with the far right is huge. He started building it from the 90s, and I would say he's the person who has the largest network of the European far right politicians. So he can bring them. He establishes contacts. Yeah? He brings them in, and then those contacts are used and employed by more significant figures. For example, for a very long time he worked with the Russian Orthodox ultranationalist businessman Konstantin Malofeev, who sponsored the first outbreaks of separatism in eastern Ukraine. And he's under sanctions now. And Malafeev had two media resources. One is called Katechon, the website. Another website is called Tsargrad TV. And Dugin was an editor, chief editor of those two media resources. But Dugin was too radical even for Malafeev, so he got fired. And now, essentially, he was also fired from the Moscow State University, where he taught political sociology. So now he essentially only has his international Eurasianist movement, but it's a minuscule organization. It's not really functional. But he's a good, networker, and this is how he's important.
Talking about networks, you already alluded to economic interests on both sides. What's the role of business? I just talked to a former colleague before we started about Gazprom, for example, who are sponsoring, all kinds of football clubs across Europe, and more you see, Russian companies popping up on ads and so on. So what's their role in this whole game?
Well, all those big businesses, they are not related to this cooperation with the far right. I presume these are mostly medium-sized businesses, and I would not name any names at this point, but who could be interested in this sort of cooperation. And one of the hypotheses that some experts would have about this, money link between Russian actors and the far right in Europe, that some far-right politicians would get seats on advisory boards or board of directors of particular companies, and that how essentially they would be bought by Moscow.
You talked about the FPÖ and some of its representatives and how they went to Moscow and how they, some of them forged links with United Russia, in the end signing the contract. Now the FPÖ is in government. Of course, one hypothesis would be that they cannot do, that they cannot be as explicit about the links with Russia as they have been in the past, that they indeed have to perhaps moderate to a certain degree because they're in government. Another more kind of disconcerting hypothesis would be that they actually can do more stuff now they're in government and undermine, democracy from its very heart. Do you have any evidence if their behavior, since they enter government, has changed either way?
There are some hints that they are indeed changing their behavior and starting to somehow moderate in this sense. For example, there was recently a vote in the European Parliament on political prisoners in Russia and Crimea. And the FPÖ belongs to a group in the European Parliament which is called the Europe of Nations and Freedom. And the group made this. This group has Front National, Lega, and other far-right parties, and including the FPÖ. And this group decided to vote against this resolution because it was too critical of Russia. And all four members of the FPÖ, members of the European Parliament from the FPÖ, they abstained. I believe that it is connected with the fact that they are now part of the government, and the ÖVP belongs to, in the European Parliament, it belongs to this conservative group, and the conservative group, EPP, European People's Party, it made a decision to support the resolution. So in order not to have such a contrast between these two parties at home, in the European Parliament they decided to be neutral. The FPÖ people decided to be neutral on this vote. But this vote, it has a symbolical meaning. And it does not entail any really important developments. What I'm more worried about with the FPÖ being in the government now, and especially controlling power ministries such as defense and the interior, is that some European partners have probably stopped sharing some intelligence with Austria. So it's also a security threat. Yeah, because there is not much trust in at least the power blocks of the government.
Talking about neutrality, and neutrality was a word that you mentioned in the very beginning as a very ambiguous word. Of course, Austria thinks very highly of its own neutrality. It's like a holy cow here in Austria. Now, related to that, the Chancellor Sebastian Kurz tries to frame his role and the role of the Austrian government as a bridge builder between the West and the East. And we talked about that potentially a Putin and Trump meeting is going to happen in Austria. There was, I think, a couple of days ago, there was an article in the magazine Profil where somebody commented, you only build bridges with Russia if there's the European Court of Justice on the other side of the bridge. So how do you perceive the role also in terms of, you know, the link between Russia and the Western far right? Are we building bridges to the wrong people?
Well, first let me comment on neutrality. As little as I know about Austria, I do know that neutrality is very important for Austria. But then let me give you a historical example. In the 1950s, there was an organization here in Austria called Nationale Liga, and was run by a person named Adolf Slavik, and he was a neutralist. He presented himself as the defender of Austrian neutrality. He condemned both the US and the Soviet Union. He didn't want Austria to join NATO. But later, Adolf Slavik documents emerged that he was completely bought up by the Soviets, and he got money from the Soviet Union via this organization on the Soviet property in Austria. He was essentially an agent, but the cover for him was that he was a neutralist. And in many cases, when you have far right people talking about neutrality, it's just a cover up. Yeah, it's a Potemkin village in a way. Yes, we see that those bridges are being built. Russian actors, you know, the Russian part of those bridge. This is essentially an authoritarian right-wing regime. I would not go as far to state it's a fascist state. No, it's not a fascist state, but it's clearly a right-wing authoritarian regime. And now with the American president, who is unlikely to support liberal democracy worldwide, we see that Europe is, you know, between these two fires. And as Guy Verhofstadt would say, that we now have a fifth column in Europe, and this fifth column is represented by the far right, that is now our bedfellows with the authoritarian regime, and also with Trump, in a way.
Thanks. I could ask some more questions, but at this point I would like to ask you whether there are comments or questions at this point. If you have, just raise your hand. There's a roving mic. Just perhaps tell us your name and please state your question or comment.
My name is Klaus Potsch. I would like to know what is in the party agreements between, let's say, in particular FPÖ and United Russia. What do they cooperate in?
In a way, it's a very simple agreement. Because it's a cross-party agreement, there is a lot of space devoted to sharing information and sharing ideas about party building between these two parties. This is the agreement is also about having conferences and meetings, etc., etc. It's also about contributing to the development of Austrian-Russian friendship, various youth groups, women's organizations. So there is nothing really, I would say, dodgy about this agreement. since now the FPÖ is part of the government, some of the parts they may be suspicious, like it's about sharing information about the foreign policy. But we don't know. I mean, they don't really need the agreement to share information. It's just, I tell you, this is the agreement. They have a symbolical meaning. This is not that was not the first and not the last agreement that was signed by the United Russia. For example, they would have a similar cooperation agreement with the far-right party in Serbia, and I believe that the contents were the same, and the timing of the signing of the agreement with that Serbian party was that this party was running in the election, and the signing took place just 2 weeks before the election. So again, it was a symbolical meaning that party is supported by Russia. Yeah. And in the Italian case, again, the timing was very important. It was after the referendum that failed about the constitutional reform, and Matteo Salvini, who was campaigning against the referendum, again, by signing this agreement, that was also, a sign of political support. There is also a suspicious place that was about contributing to the development of business relations between the two countries, but again, they don't need this agreement to have that cooperation.
Franz, there's another question.
Franz Rosa, Donaustadt. I worked in Moscow until '94 for an Austrian company as head of a representative office, and I followed the discussions in the Russian parliament. I remember a discussion, by the way, Mrs. Starovoitova, who was murdered later, that there is a doctrine of Moscow saying that Russia and Moscow wants to have special influence in all states which bordered to former Soviet Union. Is it still in force according to your information, this doctrine?
Yes, and the doctrine is called near abroad. So this is the idea that you have these countries that are far away. They were never part of the Soviet Union and not even the socialist bloc. But all those countries, with the exception of the Baltic states, the 3 Baltic states, in Russia they are considered to be countries of the near abroad. So they are, in this understanding, they are not really independent from the Russian point of view. So yes, this doctrine is still in place. There are some organizations that work to uphold this doctrine. They are very active in various countries, but not only in these near abroad region, but also in the EU.
There's a question.
Thank you. I'm Jonathan. I was wondering, you were talking about the aims of this cooperation with the far-right parties, and you were explicitly saying that it was about ending the sanctions against Russia. However, how would you think that it's also, does it go even further as to say that its goal is also to undermine and even to destroy the European Union, as we've seen with the meddling in the Brexit elections, as well as Western liberal democracy? Is that an implicit goal of this cooperation?
Well, that would probably not be on the part of the far right, of the European far right. The Euroscepticism of those parties, this is essentially Euroscepticism of the parties in the opposition. If you criticize the establishment, liberal democratic establishment, going after the EU, criticizing Brussels is the right strategy for some of them, for the populists. When they are in power, I presume that this may change. This already changed, I believe, with the FPÖ, and especially if you remember when the referendum on Brexit happened, Hofer changed his position on the European Union because Austrians were so outraged that he could no longer, follow this hard line on exit. Yeah? But from the Russian side, yes, I think the main goal of the Russian Federation, in my point of view, is to have sort of a second Yalta agreement. To go back to the time when the world was divided into various spheres of influence. Moscow would like something like that. It wants to go to business as usual. The problem for Russia, at least till now, was that the West has been quite united, quite strong, and it would not allow for this second Yalta agreement. So in order still to have this second Yalta agreement is to undermine the West, to make it weaker, so it doesn't really oppose this idea of this worldwide agreement. And the far right is one of the ways to undermine the European Union, to weaken it, to weaken the transatlantic relations, to weaken the Western unity as such. So it's also an instrument, in a way, to have something else. So this short-term, mid-term strategy for Moscow is to contribute to any cause in the West that would be undermining the West by itself. Moscow is not creating problems. It looks for weak places on the body of the West, and just point fingers, to make things worse. But the problems that with the far right and other organizations, they would also be happy to support the far left if the far left was strong, and some isolationists. But they would use any opportunity to harm the West, to make it weaker.
There's another question.
Thank you very much for your presentation. My name is Julian. I had a question about election interference. You talked very much about election interference during your presentation, and now as well concerning Brexit. My question was, what parallelisms, if any, could you draw between Russian election interference in the European Union and the election interference we have seen during the 2016 presidential elections in the United States, concerning goals and methods in particular? Thank you.
As far as I understand, with the 2016, with the elections in the US, the larger part of it was not really via Facebook or Twitter, although they all proven cases. But that was in the area of cyber, with the leaks, with the essential collusion of the Trump team with the Russian actors. So it was something else. But the elections in Europe and Brexit, although Brexit was, I think, similar to the American case, but with other elections, it's mostly about political support and media support. The media, I wouldn't say that RT or Sputnik really supported Trump during the presidential campaign, but there was another area of collusion. But here it's mostly political support and media support. The thing is that in many cases of interference and meddling, operations cannot be similar to each other. If a trick was successful in some place, well, people would know about the trick and they would be prepared for it. Yeah, this is how actually Macron was quite successful in blocking interference in a way, because his campaign, his team, Macron team, they knew that the Russians would try to hack their emails. So they created several bogus email addresses and mailboxes. And when the Russian hackers hacked some of them, or one of them, and they would upload this information on the internet, they would leak it, Macron campaign said, yes, we created those fake accounts, and this information, it's meaningless. It was a very clever, it was a very smart move. But again, you cannot, and this is why you cannot use, similar operations all the time. You have to create something else. So your opponent would not be prepared.
So the far right has had quite a run, but then recently in some places it has stalled. Hofer wasn't successful, of course. Le Pen wasn't successful yet, one might add, perhaps. Salvini and the Lega are now in the government. The FPÖ is in government. So it's in some places they have been successful, in others not so much. What's next for the International of the Nationalists? What looking into the future, 5 years ahead, what do you expect them to do next? How will they organize them? Will they try to keep a low profile in order not to raise suspicion, or will they even mobilize more? Will they band together more than in the past?
Yeah, I see now, today I see developments that far-right parties, they are coming together more and more. They are empowered not so much by the successes of the FPÖ or the Lega, but they are empowered by the success of Orbán's regime in Hungary. And essentially Fidesz has become a far-right party in the recent years. They had Jobbik as a far-right party, but Jobbik, in contrast, it moved closer to the center. And now Fidesz is the far-right party. And Orbán, he has a mission. He has a pan-European vision. He wants to change Europe, and he doesn't know yet how to do it, but he wants to do it.
He recently held the pistol to the head of the EPP group, right? He said, if you don't change, I will found my own group and find my own friends outside of EPP, right?
Yes, and I think one of his dreams is to become president of the European Union, and this empowers others. And also it does contribute to building of the illiberal bloc in Europe. We may say that the government in Poland is not entirely liberal. Then Slovenia has problems with nationalism. We should also watch Sweden this year in September. They are having elections, and the Sweden Democrats, the far-right party there, has all the chances to become the most popular party, or at least the second most popular party. Probably they will not be forming a government. Most likely the center-wing moderate party will be doing this, but there are in some quarters of the moderate party, there are talks about maybe inviting the Sweden Democrats to the coalition government as a junior partner.
So Orbán is the role model not only of Chancellor Kurz, but also of the far right in Austria, which is an interesting role to play. And so far he's been quite successful with Visegrad and other initiatives. Right? What's the role of Visegrad there? Would you say is in this gameplay?
I don't think that. Well, sometimes we're talking about this illiberal Visegrad group, but I would say that Slovakia and the Czech Republic, they are still holding. I mean, they are not model countries, but still they're holding. And there is too much mythological about this idea of illiberal Visegrad but they may start with trying to illiberalize the Visegrad 4 and then sort of invite other countries. But again, I think that the situation in Italy is now much worse than in Slovakia or the Czech Republic. Italy actually worries me a lot, because they are too radical, and the Lega and the recent reports about those refugee boats. It doesn't really matter how you approach this problem with the refugees, but what they are doing is really extreme.
I think if you look at Hungary, if you look at movements like Momentum, or if you look at Slovakia, movements like Progressivne, they're still quite young, right? They're still emerging. They're still quite fragile in a way. And on the other hand, you have those government machines that are really powerful and strong. Are there any more questions from the audience or comments that you want to say? Please.
Yes, just about the economic. Just about the economic power of Russia. We were wondering, how can Russia afford all this meddling around in all kinds of elections and referendums? How can they afford doing cooperation with all kinds of far-right parties everywhere in Europe, even though their GDP is inferior to Italy's, for example, even though they have no innovation, their economy is stalling? Will they be able to continue this in the years to come, or will there come a point where it's just not possible to afford all this anymore?
Will we have another 1989, so to say, at some point?
No, but I don't think that they have in their annual budget they have this line for meddling in the elections. So it's not part of the budget. There is a budget for RT and Sputnik and other media resources, but with all the other things, it's not the state itself, as an official institute that does this. These are elites, various elite groups. For example, well, again, when talking about the ruling class in Russia, it's not a homogeneous institution. You have various groups around the Kremlin with some access to the Kremlin that compete with each other for resources. Economically, Russia is in a very bad shape. But so the resources that are managed by the Kremlin, they are scarce. So those groups, they have to compete for those resources. And they do all these things. They want to show to the Kremlin that they're useful, that they can do this, that they can promote Russian foreign policy interests. So these groups are involved in those meddling cases, not the state as such, except for the media, which is state funded.
Last question. Although the topic of tonight is Russia and the Western far right, and Europe most of all, but do you think the Russians have compromised on President Donald Trump?
I wouldn't know, really. Probably they have something, not necessarily that fascinating as we were promised. But he traveled to Russia many times. And obviously, when politicians go to Russia, if they don't care about their security, the FSB, try to find something on them. And this is how they work. This is the old KGB tactics. In the KGB textbooks, you would find information how to recruit people, and this all starts with inviting them to Russia and going to saunas and restaurants and
like many FPÖ representatives have. Anton, thank you very much for this very interesting evening. Thank you for your questions and for your comments. The book Tango Noir, Russia and the Western Far Right, is you can buy it on Amazon.
Yes, and it's also now translated into German, but not yet published.
All right, it's actually we have it back there.
Yes,
thank you, Esther.
Yeah.
So if you want to buy it in English, you can buy it today. If you want to buy it in German, you can buy it soon. Thanks a lot.
Thank you for having me, and
of
thank
course.
you for coming.
Thanks, and have a drink on us.